Grazie, questo. Welcome, all of you. This is our 25th Academia Bessarion. And this time, because it was Phil Roughton who said, yes, let's talk about Sara Parker Remond, that I'm a bit recycling talks that I've already given elsewhere, which is cheating a bit. This was a talk I gave in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital to doctors and nurses, and it was really an amusing experience. But I wanted to talk about Sara Parker Remond in her context. And I begin by mentioning Alcmaeon, Aristotle's physician, said, "We die because we do not join the end to the beginning." And on our tombs, we have these beautiful Ouroboros, where the serpent is devouring its tail as a symbol of eternity. Sara Parker Remond, my friend Marilyn Richardson, she came to participate in a conference we did here on the Americans in the English cemetery. And she was talking about Edmonia Lewis, who was a sculptress, part Native American and part African. And also she was talking about Sara Parker Remond. She was trying to find where Sara Parker Remond was buried. And I found where she was buried because I was in the Rome Protestant cemetery for my father's and my brother's burials there. And I looked on the page for our ancestor, who was Richard Rothwell, the Irish painter, who painted the portrait of Mary Shelley. And there on the same page was Sara Parker Remond. Her tomb was lost, but what Marilyn Richardson and Francis Mayo did was to put together a fund, and they then placed this plaque in the Rome Protestant Cemetery to celebrate her as the African-American abolitionist and physician. She's the first woman MD, and this is the story about her. It's a wonderfully courageous story. But first we need to give the story of Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, where sometimes I end up because, I've got a dicky heart and all of that. And this was founded by Dante's Beatrice's father. But also her nurse founded its nursing order, the Oblati, which then Florence Nightingale would copy for the Crimea. And then later, Hugo van der Goes, not in the 13th century, but in the 15th century, for a descendant of Bocco Portinari, painted this. And it's the shepherds coming to the Virgin in the stable. And the Christ child is laid on the bare earth, not exactly sterile, but he represents us in our poverty. And this was a hospital founded to care for the poor pilgrims, to those who were destitute, who were in great poverty. And many of our Swiss burials here from the Grigioni, who spoke Romansh from the mountains, who were then illiterate, who were working as barista in Florence, dying at 18 of tuberculosis, died in this hospital and were buried here because they were Swiss by the Swiss church. This is our cemetery, and it's a wonderful mixture of illegitimate king's sons, like William IV's son, William Henry Sewell, like the Queen's Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn, her aunt who died of TB, and of slaves and serfs and servants all together. And I live in this house at the right-hand side with its library, and this is from where I'm giving this talk. And this is what it was like when I first came, put to weed killer. It was poisoned, it was vandalized, there were syringes, there were black masses, there were suicide attempts. And then the Roma came and asked if they could garden. And they planted the wild irises, which are Florence's lily. And they completely changed it. It was no longer the erosion of the mud coming into the library. The hill was held, the tombs no longer were leaning, they were straightened by the Roma, who were brilliant craftspeople. They also built the library bookshelves, they built cradles for their babies, and we've sort of created a little bit of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And this is what it is like with the wild irises in bloom. This is the tomb of the uncle of the Mannerheim who founded Finland as a new nation. And we were awarded the medallion, the prize of the Nicholas Stenone, who is a Danish doctor who showed up in Florence and became a saint. And welcome. And so what happened, in a sense, was that we were repeating the story against slavery. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she was from a slave owning family in Jamaica. And as you can see, she is not a blue eyed, blonde haired English woman. She is herself part African. And this is something that African Americans have known, but white scholars have tried to sweep under the carpet. They don't want to know about it. But I've loved being able to celebrate this story because it's a story of liberation, of Black Lives Matter. And I have managed to persuade the Comune of Florence to grant her the laurel wreath to her tomb, which was designed by Frederick Lord Leighton. And we also have to, just today, received, this is the cover, I'm afraid I've reproduced it rather badly, but it's Michelangelo's Aurora. And the title of the book, this is the translation into Italian of Elizabeth's poetry. And the title is going to be O Bella Libertà, which she hears little boys singing at the Risorgimento beneath her window in Casa Guidi. And Rita Severi and I have edited it, and we've got all of our friends to translate all of the different poems. It was a wonderful project. It's been going on for 20 years. And then there's also Frances Trollope, and we've now published with the Trollope Society her Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, which is a wonderful novel. I think she's better than Anthony, her son, because she writes like Jane Austen, but with vinegar and a heart of gold. And she's very concerned about social issues, but she uses that also with humor. And she traveled up the Mississippi from England. She was married to an incompetent lawyer and she had to support the family. And she went with their tutor, who was a member of the Royal Academy, French exile, Auguste Evo, who illustrated the scenes they actually saw, putting them into the novel, although it's also a documentary describing what American slavery was like before Queen Victoria was on the throne, lynching and all. Then there's Theodore Parker, he's also buried with us. And he was preaching in Boston with a loaded gun at the pulpit because the slave catchers wanted to assassinate him because he was destroying their profits. Frederick Douglass visited his tomb. It was a rather wretched tomb and insisted on a better one being made, and went to William Wetmore Story, who was the outstanding American sculptor at that time in Rome, who did the very beautiful tomb of his wife as the winged angel in the Rome Protestant cemetery. And on the tomb are inscribed the lines that Frederick Douglass wrote in his diary. Remember that Frederick Douglass was a freed slave who wrote the autobiography when slaves were forbidden to know how to read and write. And in the title is written by himself. And then there's Richard Hildreth, who's just two tombs down from Theodore Parker, who wrote The White Slave, the life of Archie Moore. And here he's describing the sale of the black slaves, the children separated from their mothers. And I've been using this illustration to try to sort of prod the conscience of judges who have removed the 4 children from my Roma couple who worked for me, believing that poverty is a crime and that the children would be bettered by being put in orphanages. And it's not true. The girl now, after 8 years of not being allowed to know her language, her culture, her parents, doesn't want to go on living, and the boy is angry with the whole world. The same syndrome we have with Aborigine, the residential schools in Canada and America. And it's interesting that these people in the 19th century were concerned about this. Then we also have a black slave buried with us. She's Nadezhda de Sanctis, and she was brought back by the expedition of Champollion and Rossellini, who were funded by the Grand Duke of Tuscany to go to Egypt and Nubia and to bring back the loot, which they divided between Florence, the Museo dell'Archeologia Nazionale, and the Louvre. And it's a very romantic painting you see above the stairs as you go into the museum. But Nadezhda, she was only 14 when she was brought here. She was baptized in a Russian Orthodox family, which is why you have the Russian Orthodox cross with the good thief and the bad thief and the scales. And her story is written in Cyrillic, and you can see the word Nadezhda and Nubia. And then Frederick Douglass visited here to honor these burials. And Daniel Dumitrescu, whose own family were slaves in Europe, the Roma, he did the incision of this lapide, which we've got, this plaque, which we've got here in the cemetery, recording the date when he came. Because I believe the history should be written bottom up. But it's an important history. My friend Elise Boulding, who was Quaker, she wrote a wonderful book called The Underside of History. And that is a history I think we need to not forget, but to record. And then this is Frederick Douglass's diary, which is now in the Library of Congress, where he actually describes visiting these tombs of Theodore Parker, and where he uses the lines that eventually will be put on the tomb by the sculptor, that he freed mankind from slavery and superstition. And one of the reasons why Florence was more open racially than other parts of Europe was that the last Medici, Duke Alexander, was the son of a black slave, and they're not sure who his father was. Was it his brother or the Pope? But at any rate, he became the ruler of Florence, its Black Prince. And also, these people worked for the rights of women and children. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Margaret Fuller, the American woman who was traveling and came to Italy to write the history of the Risorgimento, a history that was lost in the shipwreck in which she and her husband and her baby drowned. Jessie White Mario, who kept applying to medical school and everyone turned her down. No, women couldn't be doctors, but she was running the hospitals for Garibaldi. Anita Garibaldi, who was beside Garibaldi, even dying following when she was pregnant and being buried in the sand as they were escaping at the fall of the Roman Republic. Mary Somerville, who's responsible for the invention of the computer, brilliant woman scientist with no education, who was writing textbooks for Cambridge University students, which she could not attend. She wrote in her diary that she wished, in her 90s, as she was dying, that she wished she could live to see the end of slavery. And she had taught mathematics to Ada Lovelace, who then, with Charles Babbage, invented the computer as we know it. Fanny and Theodosia Trollope. Theodosia is, of course, I've misspelled her name, but she is the daughter of Joseph Garrow, and she is the daughter-in-law of Fanny Trollope. Christina Princess Belgioso was also running hospitals for Garibaldi in Rome. Christina Temple Burdoin is the one who invented the keyboard for the Morse code, which then became the Olivetti typewriter, which then became our computer keyboard. And we forget these stories. And Sarah Guppy's daughter, she invented the Clifton suspension bridge. And so I feel it's important that women's girls in schools get to know of the possibilities that women had. I often ask this question of my visitors: who invented the computer? It's complete silence, except perhaps somebody might say Turing. And I have to say, it's before Turing, and show these two images of them. And then we have Gian Pietro Vissier, who formed the Cabinet of Vissier. He's Swiss. And in his library, because it was a private library, the Grand Duke panicked after being very liberal, was afraid of a revolution ousting him, which ended up happening. Elizabeth was part of that. But he was censoring the press, and you couldn't read the European newspapers or modern novels. So in Cabinet of Vissier, you could, because it was private. And amongst its readers were Sara Parker Remond, Afro-American Black, Fyodor Dostoevsky, John Ruskin, Robert Browning, he's also part Black and part Jewish, but not Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because Robert lied to her, saying that women were not allowed, which was absolutely not true, because there was also Lady Blessington and also Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, who were readers. Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, he got Elizabeth Barrett Browning to write Cry of the Children, and Francis Trollope to write Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy. He was deeply concerned about the slums. He took Charles Dickens around them to show them before Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. And Leigh Hunt's epitaph on his tomb speaks of the need for fresh air and sunlight in the homes of the poor. Beside him is buried his daughter, who was running a school in Florence. His granddaughter, whom he raised, is Octavia Hill, who founds the National Trust, but was also deeply involved in social housing for the poor, carrying out her grandfather's desires. And now we come to medicine and the English cemetery. We've got so many doctors here. I was writing this first in Italian for the Italian audience. So David Dumbrick with Florence Nightingale and the Crimea. Dr. Bartolomeo Ottocini, we'll come back to those two. Vicomte Henri de la Bellinais, he was a noble Frenchman who had to escape from the revolution. He was practicing medicine on Wimpole Street, then went back to France and then came to Florence. Dr. William Wilson from Scotland, he was one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's doctors, and he buries his wife here. Dr. Gresanowski from Prussia was this very elegant bedside doctor whom I think was prescribing too much laudanum to Elizabeth. And so forth. Dr. Augustus Kirch, we've got his tomb, and his descendants have helped us get it restored. So Thomas Sylvestre was practicing in India and also here. He was having to treat duelists in the Lucca dukedom. Edward Porteous was at the Battle of Trafalgar. Dr. Alexander de Lissa is buried here with two of his children. Puget was practicing in India. James Craigie was a suicide. Russian doctor. So James Annesley had written this huge book, which is in my library here, on tropical fevers, and he's from Ireland and India. And so on. The list goes on and on. William Somerville is Mary Somerville's husband. She's buried in Naples. He is here. And then John Logan Campbell. He was a Scottish doctor who went out to New Zealand, and he founded the city of Auckland. And he would come to Florence, and his little boy died here, and so he's buried with us. And the family has died out. But when I wrote to their trust, And our restorer said to restore this tomb, which had been very badly damaged with acido muriatico. I think that's hydrochloric acid, which eats into the marble. They immediately sent a check for €4,000 to restore it, which we did, and so on. So we've got all of these doctors here, but most of them didn't know to wash their hands when delivering babies. So many of the mothers died as a result. I love this one. This is Dr. Bartolomeo Odicini. And he was Anita Garibaldi's doctor and for her children in Uruguay when Garibaldi was fighting for Latin American freedom. And this is him with his family, the daughter and so forth. And he has his tomb. He refuses to be buried in a Catholic cemetery because he thinks the Pope should be carrying out the gospel. And he has his inscription written in Spanish instead of Italian, but he is Italian. And then the next one is David Dumbrek, who was rather difficult for Florence Nightingale, with all of his medals, including the one for the Crimea, which his widow has given to the sculptor to sculpt on his tomb. And Robin Dumbrek, his descendant, came and gave me the photographs of the medals, which he still has. And then in the Galileo Museum, the catalogue, it shows, I've misspelled the instruments, shows the instruments used and invented by Brambilla, the forceps, for delivering babies. And here you can see the doctor has not necessarily changed into PPT. And I would be really alarmed at such a situation in childbirth. And these are the women who did die following childbirth from these procedures. Fanny Holman Hunt, who is the wife of Holman Hunt, and he in his grief sculpts her tomb. The baby lived and was called Benoni, like Rachel's child. She had died in childbirth in the Old Testament. And then Louise Kunis, brilliant painter. This is her self-portrait. She dies in childbirth. And Sara McAlmont, her descendants came and had her tomb restored and gave me the photograph of her portrait. And they described the clergyman husband having to push the carriage up the Alps with the baby and its nurse in it to get them home to England after she died. So the illnesses we have from childbirthing, Emma Gamgee, Cape, we'll come to her again, Fanny Holman Hunt, Sara McAlmont, Selina Garinet, Maria Mercadante, Louise Lecomte Kunis, Horatia Augusta Robley Borghese, and many others. Tuberculosis, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but she dies more from laudanum than from TB. Leontiev Levitsky, the boy much beloved by the Tsar of Russia, but who was Polish. Jonas Kielander, who was a Swedish PhD student from Uppsala doing philosophy. Countess Charlotte Bowes-Lyon, the Queen's aunt, the Queen Mother's aunt. Ellis William de Lissa, Georgiana Clementina Sloper, Theodosia Trollope, Beachy Trollope. When it gets into a family, it's like COVID. You really need to keep all your windows open, which is what I advise Roma families who have TB to do, and pay for them to have extra windows. Diphtheria, many children, Mary Spencer Stanhope, Alice Charles and Charles Cottrell, John Logan Campbell. Malaria, Arthur Hugh Clough. Cholera, Robina Wilson, Catherine Jane Penfold Baroncelli. Cancer, Cornelia Lorin. And that's very interesting because her two doctors are Wilson and Gresanowski, who are the same doctors as Elizabeth had. And in the letters, I've been able to learn a great deal about Elizabeth's dying. Tetanus is Louisa Catherine Adams Kuhn. She is Henry Adams' sister, who is in the Chaos chapter of the Education of Henry Adams. He also wrote Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. And suicide, James Craigie and Adelaide DeLisa, the sister of the boy who died, she threw herself out of the window the day he died of TB. Now to come to the learning of modern medicine. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in Istanbul learned about the Roma doing inoculation against smallpox. And so she introduced that in England. Edward Jenner was able to see that cowpox was safer than actual smallpox. And Ignaz Semmelweis, he was observing that the ward where the midwives, women came who washed their hands, the fatality rate was low. But where the men doctors came immediately after carrying out autopsies for delivering babies, the mothers died like flies from sepsis. Louis Pasteur, who observed the need for the concept of bacteria. Domenico Chiara, nobody talks much about him, but he published an excellent book because in the same year in Florence that Sara Parker Remond was studying obstetrics in Florence, he observed in Parma that the women being delivered by midwives did much better than the women delivered by men who didn't wash their hands. The same findings that Ignaz Semmelweis. And then there's Joseph Lister, and his family is connected to the Gamgees, who are the mother who dies in childbirth of twins. She is from that family here in this cemetery. Women and medicine. We were not allowed to be doctors, but we could run hospitals, and Princess Belgiojosa did, Margaret Fuller did, Jessie White Mario did, Florence Nightingale did. Octavia Hill instead was seeing the need for better housing to create better health. And one woman pretended to be a man and became head of the military hospital, succeeding Sir David Dumbreck, and that was Dr. James Barry, who would swear like a trooper and had left strict instructions when she died, her body was not to be washed. The charwoman didn't know this, washed it and came rushing out saying, "She's a woman and she's had a baby." And when I said this in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, the men said, "But how would she know?" And all the women laughed because we know about the striae from having had babies and that our bodies will never be quite the same again. But Sara Parker Remond in London, she was lecturing against slavery in America and also in England, where she became friends with Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini. And they encouraged her. Giuseppe Mazzini wrote the letter for her to come. They were both, all of them, in exile, to come to study cutting edge obstetrics at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. Because the Grand Duke was trying to do everything right. He didn't quite catch on about the washed hands business. But the theory of obstetrics was taught at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital from 1805, using wax models conserved now at La Specola by the Grand Duke, and they're extraordinary to see, and who saw to it that the practice carried out on poor and unmarried women at the Hospital of the Innocenti, while the respectable married women were childbirthed in their homes with the help of a male obstetrician in each quarter of the city, assisted by his students. And this is why the educated, respectable women were dying like flies, because the men didn't catch on the need for hygiene. Remember in the old days, if someone was going to have a baby, the husband was always sent to boil water. And that's part of the syndrome, to have hygiene done by the midwives. And these are the wax models. There's a very, very beautiful one, but I was only allowed to use it once in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, of two twins, Gemelli, yin yang, and I just wish I could show it to you. But we remember that Emma Gamgee Capet was the daughter of Dr. Samson Gamgee, I should have misspelled that, colleague of Dr. Joseph Lister and wife to Dr. Lorenzo Capet. And one of the members of our association was his descendant, who was descended from the previous babies of Emma Gamgee Capet. She died in childbirth of twins, 15th of July, 1863. And this is the story on her tomb, that she was so lovely in her modesty and her beauty and her cleverness of mind and so forth. And she is now in her last sleep because of this long childbirth of twins. And she leaves 4 children and her husband Lorenzo Capet and so forth. And I love Dr. Lorenzo Capet. He was such a gentle person. He's no longer alive, but he came to me because of this tomb. And then these are the tools that Alessandro Brambilla, the square outside Careggi Hospital, which is our university hospital, is called Brambilla after him, and how to use the forceps. And then we have Frederick Douglass going on from the English cemetery to Rome. And there he finds Sara Parker Remond and her sister. And also they're staying there, and he's so delighted to see them because he knew them when they were young girls. And he also so appreciated their brother, who was a great lecturer against slavery. And what is interesting is that Florence's great art was because the medical research was also being carried out by the artists. They could participate in the dissections of cadavers to learn about the musculature, which you see Leonardo da Vinci and so forth. And then we have these women sculptors who would not be allowed to work with the cadavers. Félicie de Fauveau, she sculpts 2 tombs here. Edmonia Lewis, who sculpts in Rome. Harriet Hosmer, Edmonia is part black, part Native American. Harriet Hosmer is American. Amalia Dupre and her descendant is my friend Amalia Chadi Dupre, also a brilliant sculptress. William Wetmore Story and Hiram Powers. But they were all active in this period. And Hiram Powers, who's buried here in this cemetery and much admired by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, he sculpts the Greek slave, which is the very center of Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851. And the last of her tribe, because he's part Native American, beautiful moccasins he sculpts on her feet. And America, which I think is more beautiful than the Statue of Liberty given to America by France. But it was shipwrecked, and that is just a sculpture in clay, not in marble. This is Elizabeth's sonnet to Hiram Powers' Greek slave. They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anguish. On the threshold stands an alien image with the shackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the sculptor meant her that passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed, not darkened, where the sill expands, to so confront men's crimes in different lands with man's ideal sense, pierce to the center art's fiery finger, and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face, not alone east griefs, but west, and strike and shame the strong. And we're calling our book on the cemetery White Silence, Thunders of White Silence. And she's speaking there against serfdom in Russia and slavery in America, and also against her own father, who is the slave owner. And this is the translation into Italian. Now, the noble Cantacuzene family, descended from Byzantine emperors, possessed Roma slaves in Romania and were guests here in Florence of the Prince Demidov, the Russian prince. And my Roma have restored the tomb of Joan Cantacuzene. This is a Roma slave village in Romania, and that's pretty much the way they still live in camps in Florence, with whatever they can find. Situation extremely inhumane. This is Lorenzo Bartolini's sculpture to Prince Demidov, who was a great philanthropist and who was setting up, he was in a wheelchair from himself being an invalid, setting up clinics for the poor and so forth. And his statue is on the other side of the Arno. Then you have Lord Leighton, Frederick Lord Leighton, sculpting the broken slave shackle on Elizabeth's tomb. And here is the slave poster selling 10 men, 7 women, and 3 children, etc., slaves in Romania. And Frederick Douglass visited here, 11th of May, and the daughters of my ordinand student when I was tutor, when I was in the convent, the twins, they came and they taught the Roma how to do the sculpting of letters on marble. And Daniel did this, and his ancestors were slaves. And we've put this on our wall. And I feel this is the way to write history from the underside. And the possibility is that we will be able to put the next plaque beside Mona Tessa. This is her grave stele. She's the one who founded the nursing order 700 years ago, across the street from Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, where they kept washing the sheets and the towels, and they would go over in a tunnel to the hospital and wash the floors and change the sheets and towels. I noticed when I was there, twice a day, and they've been doing it for 700 years. And the men never tumbled to it that they needed to wash their hands. But we would like to be able, not this, which was done by a machine and a great expense. I designed this and Daniel carried it out, and here it is. We're getting into a little bit of a problem because the women who are helping me help the Santa Maria Nuova Hospital carry out this project don't think that a Roma is good enough and would like it done by a machine professionally. I think it should be this one instead of the machine-made one. And here is Sara Parker Remond, and we come back to Alcmaeon, Aristotle's physician, saying we die because we do not join the end to the beginning, and the Ouroboros on the tomb. And here we have the chance now to go up to all of this. We can close the Condivisione unless you want to go back to any of the images. Right. So here we are, Laura, Thelma, and let's see, possono influire. Are you hearing me all right? They're saying something is wrong with the audio. Okay.
It's fine. Yeah, we can hear fine. No problem.
I can hear you well, Julia.
Yes, and
Yes.
this is being recorded, so we'll be able to share it as well. Comments, questions, etc. I want to hear your voices. I'm getting tired of mine.
Just thank you very much, first of all.
Thank you. Thelma, and I should remember your name, that both of you. Yes, you wrote the most wonderful essay on the family, the Trollops and so forth. And it's on the web and it's so appreciated. And then also we have the descendant who gave us the photograph of Joseph Garrow, who is a little Indian boy with his half sister who's terribly English, and their dead father and the dead brother and father, who is also very English. But he was the son of an Indian princess, and the money was left for his education, the best possible education that could be had. And he's the first translator of Dante's Vita Nuova into English. It's a beautiful edition, which I was able to order from India through COVID from New Delhi, and it came in a beautiful bound edition. It's nothing, it cost only €8, and there it was, bound in leather with gold tooling, and so I was just touched by that. Right. Lara, do you have comments?
Well, I'm just thinking about what you said about was it the nuns at the Ospedale delle Innocenti that didn't think a Roma was good enough to do the plaque?
It's the it's not Santa Maria Nuova Hospital themselves. They were enthusiastic about the project and felt it was right to include a woman doctor who was Black. It was the Italian academic women who said, no, it's incorrect. You shouldn't say Studio La Medicina, because that's not modern Italian, that's the archaic Victorian Italian. And also they said, no, you should put the birth date and the death date, not the 2 years she was studying. And I've been able to get around that because everyone says, no, it is correct to use the archaic Italian. And also all we need to do is add a comma after Studio La Medicina, comma, 1866, 1868. So we can get around it. It's just that even today, I had, they need to do a burial of a relative. And when we do the second burial, we ask €400. And when they heard that I would be paying the Roma just part of it, they refused to give the €400. No, we won't pay Roma. But they were paying a very, very expensive funeral parlor to do all the rest, and expecting that the people who actually did the burial could go unpaid just because they weren't considered human beings. I was fuming. I didn't know how to deal with it. I said, well, I will pay them out of my own pocket. and guilt tripping them.
But you're saying that you encounter this frequently in the attitude of the people, the Italians.
It's subtle. For instance, at the same time, I had wanted the cover like my Elizabeth Barrett Browning Penguin. So the whole figure of Aurora, the naked woman, and with the bandiera of the Risorgimento, the red, white, and green Italian flag across there. And literally, they've been uneasy about the book. They are publishing it, but they managed to come up with just a mental image, just the head of Aurora. And they've censored the body and they've censored the bandiera. And in doing so, they also censored, I wanted the photograph of the sunlight coming into Casa Guidi, where she describes a little boy standing in the sunlight. Oh, no, that picture's not right. We can't put that in. And I keep saying, you actually need to, in your iconography, you need to get as close to the meaning of the written words. And they can't see that because they sort of, there's prejudice against women, are prejudiced against women. At Princeton, we had this very difficult situation where we were the first generation of women as professors, and there had been black male professors before us, so we were the last on the totem pole. And there was a black janitor who straightened his hair, Ambrose, and we were terrified of him because he had the keys to our office, and we'd be working in our offices at night because of the pressure to publish or perish. And he would come in and really get very close to us. So we were taking our dogs into our offices to protect ourselves and so forth. And we would complain, and they would say, "Oh, a black janitor is worth more than a woman assistant professor." And so we couldn't win that one. But I think these are the tragedies of the ways in which discrimination happens. And I'm sort of gently running up against them. But I think it's worthwhile having these plaques done by the Roma, who only one of them is literate. All of the others have been blocked from any schooling, blocked from any decent housing, and yet they're so skilled. They've done everything to save the cemetery. No one else has. They do all of the burials, they do all of the tomb restoration, the gardening, and yet they're not considered worthy of being paid. And so it's an interesting experiment I've got. And, discrimination is a nasty beast, and it's so lovely when you get this multiculturalism. I mean, I've loved being with the Roma, with the wealth of the storytelling. Is wonderful stories straight out of Shakespeare and Apuleius. Their Byzantine culture from Romania, because they are part of the Roman Empire of the East. And before that, the Indian, Turkish, and Persian. These are not uncultured people. They've just been blocked from literacy, but they've got everything else. And they've got better manuality than we have. And so but most people understand and appreciate what we do. I just ran into a rather unusual situation today, just 2 hours ago, and it's left me sort of feeling a bit flabbergasted. Phil, what do you think of it, all of this?
I was reading about Sara Parker Remond on
Yes.
Wikipedia today, and I was impressed to see that it says that the Massachusetts State House honored 6 outstanding women of the state by installing a series of marble panels and a bronze bust for each of the 6 women. And
Yes.
Raymond Dorothea Dix, who advocated for the mentally ill.
Yes.
Florence Luscombe, who was a suffragist.
Yes.
Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, who was advocated for labor unions. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who published the first newspaper by and for African American women, and Lucy Stone, who was also an abolitionist. So that I was fascinated by that,
Yes.
and to read about these women as well.
Yes. I love this movement we now have of taking the blinkers off and opening up to these new perspectives. It's there's a whole ferment going on in academia now, and I've loved writing the final chapter in my Dante book on Dante's decolonialism, sharing the importance of gender equality, appreciating women. He goes first from sort of father figures to mother figures. and being against class distinctions, the sense of nobility being superior. No, he says, or she says to him, race, he bases the commedia on Terence's comedies, and Terence was a freed black slave in Rome who wrote the purest Latin, and religion, where he talks about the Brahmin who is just and good, who has never heard of Jesus, should he be damned? And so forth. And so I've loved putting that final chapter together, including the lecture I gave at Attica State Prison, where most of the prisoners were Black or Native American or Irish, very few Anglo-Saxon white criminals. They can pay for lawyers, but not the others. So, realizing, and they responded to Dante marvelously, who said, the souls in hell blame everyone but themselves. Not my Princeton students, they could never have said this, but the Attica prisoners said, yes, that was me. And I was very touched by that. Laura, you haven't spoken.
Well, I'm going back to my first question.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it that wasn't happy that the Roma were engraving that plaque?
She's an Italian academic who teaches American students in the American program here.
So why would she care if the work were done by Roma instead of a machine? Why
yes,
would that? Why would she?
The penny
why would she
hasn't
object?
dropped. Okay, the penny hasn't dropped that Europe's largest, poorest minority, who were subjected to slavery and the Holocaust, the Porajmos, have a similar history as have had African Americans in America. A history of slavery, a history of being considered less than human. And they're still considered less than human. And this is just one of the few places where we've done the reverse. And it's been so successful. I mean, the change in the cemetery is enormous because we did it. The energy here is enormous, the kindness. And most of our clients are thrilled about this. And many of them actually came and bought locally here because they appreciated the sense that the money that they were, but it actually went to the Swiss, didn't come to us, that the money they were paying was, in a sense, righting what was wrong, carrying out justice. Does that make sense?
Yes, but that plaque, the plaque that you said someone didn't want it to be done by the Roma, where is that plaque, and where is it going? Where will it be displayed?
She's the one who decided that she's the one to write the document to ask permission for the plaque to be placed. So she's got it under her control. And I, as a foreigner, do have to let an Italian do that.
Okay.
But it's a bit sticky that, I was realizing it was, they corralled me before the official meeting and went on at great length saying, no, this won't do, this won't do. And I was, sort of, my heart fell right down to my boots, sort of feeling that this is the symbolism of this. If you sort of censor it out, it's falsifying the story in a way.
If you censor what out?
If you don't allow the people at the bottom to write history. This is what Catherine Arroyo wrote in her wonderful novel, Rain. She's a brilliant Kenyan Dante student. And she quotes an African writer, "When the lions write history." And this is what I'm trying to do, is to give the means to the lions to write history. And I think doing it on marble plaques, Carrara marble plaques, is one of the ways to do it, because they're so long lasting. I mean, does that make sense? It's monumentalizing. I mean, most monuments, they went for generals with bloody wars and slave owners and so forth. Why can't we have the other kind of statues, and why can't we have the other kind of plaques too? Which is what the blue plaques were doing. They were honoring the women writers like George Eliot, and Nubian Jack is honoring Black figures who have been changers and so forth, and shakers and movers. And it's giving people a voice. But what I think is happening is that women are, because we internalize a sense of inferiority, and so also do the Roma, and so also often I've seen amongst Black friends and so forth, we are battling within ourselves a sense of, we have been taught we've been inferior. So we then do the same to another. Does that make sense? And I mean, I've seen this so often, and I just trying to, just keep on going, keep on making marble plaques, and keep on suggesting these could be placed in important places. And I love the idea that this could be right by Mona Tessa, because it's 6 centuries apart, but both women were doing something extraordinary about medicine, about healing society.
Is that a plaque about Sara Parker Remond going next to Mona Tessa?
Yes, that's what Santa Maria Nuova Hospital wants to do.
And how did she get to Florence from America?
She first went to London, and she was studying at Bedford College, which was the first college permitting women at the University of London. She was studying medicine. Have you seen Call the Midwife?
Yeah.
Those nuns, I used to stay with them. They were a wonderful order. They're on Margaret Street. They were working in the slums, and they were delivering babies and burying the dead for the poor who couldn't afford funerals and so forth. And she was studying medicine with them. And then Mazzini wrote her the letter for her to bring to Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. At a time, I mean, Sir James Barry was able to become a doctor because he pretended he was a man. No women were allowed to. And this was the one situation where a woman got through and became officially an MD.
And did she take her degree in Florence or in America?
Yes.
In Florence, she did.
Yes, she finished her specialization in obstetrics at the cutting edge set up by the Grand Duke in obstetrics, just at the moment when they were realizing, which the nurses already knew, the oblate, who still exist, that the important thing was cleanliness. Sir James Barry was an extremely successful surgeon, because he always washed his hands before he conducted surgery. And so his patients survived. And in South Africa, he was stationed all over the British Empire. In South Africa, he delivered just about the first successful cesarean. And from that, major South African politicians have descended, because those babies and their mother lived. Because Sir James Barry washed his hands. And it's such a simple, effective thing, which we've been talking about during COVID. But it was very difficult for the doctors who would arrive in their ordinary street clothes without washing their hands to do surgery to realize the penny
Well,
didn't drop.
even just to attend a birth. I know
Mhm.
in American history, the clusters of women who'd given birth and then became very ill,
Yes,
all
the
attended by
sepsis.
the same doctor who went
Yes,
from house to house and
yes,
left in his wake 20 or
yes,
30 young women who died
yes.
because he didn't know about washing hands.
Mhm. And I'm afraid I've sort of been taking this a little bit further, which is rather daring. If we are now seeing in the field of medicine the presence of women and the importance of the presence of women at the level of doctors. And I went into a situation at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital some time ago, when the first pacemaker, it's about 11 years ago, when I did syncope and so forth and so on. And the ambulance attendant, who was a woman, told me what was going wrong with my heart. And when the doctor came and I said to him what she had said, he was furious. No infirmarian was allowed to tell you, only the doctor. And this was the male-female stuff going on, And I'm grateful she did, because he wasn't going to tell me. And I had the right to know medically what's going wrong with me, and so on. But now, this is a bit, take it to the Catholic Church. You couldn't allow women to be doctors. Why can't you allow women to be priests? I'll let you think about that one. And because we were, in the beginning of Christianity, Mary Magdalene was the apostle to the apostles. The widows of the altar were the ones distributing the Eucharist and so forth. The widows and virgins were allowed at the altar, not menstruating women. So women were extremely important. Christianity is a religion of women and slaves. And we have managed to subvert it away from that into a pseudo-Dionysian hierarchy. And Pseudo-Dionysius later, while pretending he was a contemporary of Paul, and was on the Areopagus, which he wasn't, because he was several centuries later and Syrian, he invents the word hierarchy, which is very convenient to the Byzantine Empire. And they adopted hook, line, and sinker. And then they give the books to the French kings, and Saint-Denis and Gothic architecture is all built on this concept of hierarchies. But it's absolutely not there in the gospel. Mary's Magnificat is about the world upside down. And I think if we could sort of play a little bit with the story of medical prejudices, gender prejudices in the delivery of medical health care, and see it as also religion is a form of therapy, a form of healing of the soul. And why shouldn't it be open to both genders?
Excuse me 1 second. I have to
Yes.
see who's at the door.
Right, okay. Phil, am I shocking you?
No.
Okay, right.
Not at all.
And it's interesting to see how almost as soon as the Church of England allowed female priests, there are a very high proportion of parishes have a female vicar.
Right, right.
Very great difficulty they didn't.
Yes, I mean, I got thrown out of the Church of England by, I was saying, I don't want to be a priest, but is it possible to fulfill the medieval roles that women had as abbesses and so forth? And I had published a volume of essays called Equally in God's Image, Women in the Middle Ages. And that made, remember, there was fierce resistance. to women priesting in the Church of England.
Yeah.
And that caused me to be thrown out. And I was a nun in a convent, an Anglican convent. And I was studying Greek and Hebrew, which our mother foundress had the nuns study to the level of priestly ordination back in the 19th century. And our order was teaching Hebrew and Greek in the Lambeth diploma. And I was trying to revive this. And all of a sudden I realized that people like Geoffrey Rao, that I was simply persona non grata. And it was easier to become Catholic than to remain Anglican at that point. And Phil remembers me from that stage. Because I had been his professor at Colorado and then gone into my convent. And then he, when I was a hermit, a Catholic hermit, invited me to Iceland, which was so wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Welcome. I still have a copy of your paper that you wrote, I think when you did a master's degree in Greek, and you wrote about Catholicism as the religion of women and slaves.
Oh, I don't remember that paper. Yes.
I'll have to dig it out and send. Yeah.
But it is why Christianity just spread like wildfire all across Europe. It wasn't a European religion, but it was the women the queens who were converting their husbands. And in Iceland, it was the Irish slaves, wasn't it, who caused the year 1000 for all of Iceland to convert to Christianity. And I think the real power comes from the bottom up, whereas the status quo does everything it can to preserve itself against that bottom. And that's where racism comes about, unfairness, injustice, perhaps. Maybe I'm being too radical.
I recently discovered that my kindergarten teacher was a published poet, and I found and she started publishing poetry on nature and the spirit at around the age of 15, and she had poems read on national radio programs and things like this. And I also found a letter to the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that she wrote in 1963 during the Civil Rights Movement, and she is describing the children in the playground, and it's a very beautiful letter, and she says she wonders when they're going to realize that one of their group is a different color. And she says, and then the song that they're singing London Bridge, and it changes to eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a, and you know, the old version of that.
Yes.
And she says, I catch my breath for a fraction of a second as my mind is crossed by a fleeting memory of the way that rhyme ended when I was a child. Will this be the end of an idyllic afternoon? And then she says, catch a tiger by the toe.
Oh, lovely. Yes.
And then it says, that's the only way that they've ever known it. And then she says, thank God for tigers. But then someone else writes a letter to the editor, and his name is Ralph C. Abilene. And it turns out he was a minister and a prominent civil rights activist at the time. And so her last name was Beaver without the A, just B-E-V-E-R.
Yes.
And he writes this beautiful letter about her sort of like saying there's hope for the children during this civil rights movement.
Yes.
And he says, with glory and love, thank God for beavers too, not just thank God for color. There's a girl named Patricia, a kindergarten teacher. Yeah. My imagination makes me a member of her class at Maryland School, which is where I went to kindergarten. I have fallen in love with her, but how shall I tell her? I won't. I'll tell the world. She has taught her children, and that includes me, to sing eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe. And he says, Patricia Beaver, you're a poet. You're the kind of teacher who knows the glory of all kinds of color. And you love kids, and that includes me. Tonight I'll pray. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray thee, Lord, PB, Patricia Beaver, to keep. So I found this so fascinating that,
Yes.
and this beautiful letter of thankfulness to her from this
Yes.
minister and
Yes.
civil rights
Yes.
activist
Yes.
during the civil rights movement, for her to take that public stand. So it was,
Phil was talking about his kindergarten teacher who was writing poetry and telling about her children she was teaching. And this is something I have found in teaching. I've taught all levels, nursery school, high school, and university and graduate school. Actually, I love the nursery school children the most because their minds are so open. I can remember the story. I used to take my typewriter and have them tell me stories, and I would type the stories, and then they would illustrate them, and then they would take them home to their parents. These are pre-literate children, and they would read the stories to their parents. But it was extraordinary the capacity that a 3-year-old child had to tell stories, 3 and 4, and so forth. And they were wonderful stories, and so forth. Laura, do you have any comments you want to make?
No, I don't think so. I feel like we've traveled very far away from your original topic, but
Yes.
I've enjoyed it.
Mhm.
But I do have another question about Sara Parker Remond.
Yes.
Did she die in Florence? Is she buried in the cemetery?
She is buried in the Rome Protestant cemetery, and I
Okay.
found her burial record. The tomb is lost, which is why they put the plaque up in the cemetery. And she married as a Sardinian and from a rather noble family who was living in Pisa. And she gathers up a kind of household in Rome with her sister, where Frederick Douglass then meets them again after having known them in Salem, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So, and this has been the experience I've just been having with Brian Della Santina, who I knew as a young boy. We bought their house and they used the money to go to Greece. And this is a family where the mother was blind with a genetic disease and brilliant, and so was the father. And we were friends, our two families together. They had 3 children and we had 3 children. And these 3 children, mixed race, have done very well, but not, financially, but they've traveled everywhere and their minds are so open. And it was just lovely. I mean, Brian now is grey haired. I'm 85 and he's in his 60s. He's married with a 19-year-old son. And we remembered so much of their childhood. When they went to Greece, they also went to Constantinople, Istanbul, and the patriarch announced to his congregation with these very Oriental children, these are American children who read, write, and speak Greek. and Brian remembers sitting in the patriarch's lap. And, so I was realizing that these are the kinds of memories that children should treasure. This rich cultural openness and the languages and Brian has also gone and visited in Myanmar during that one time when things became open. He was in China, he was in Tibet, he was in Korea. And this is something, and this is similar to Phil with his openness to travel, which I don't think the majority of Americans have that experience, do they? No.
I think a lot are doing so, and from what I've seen, there's plenty of Americans like me who've been able to live abroad and study abroad.
Yes.
Yeah, and travel and see the world.
So Phil, I have to ask you a question. What kind of guitar is sitting behind you?
That's just,
She's a musician. Yes.
uh,
He plays quite a few instruments.
that came from a friend of mine in France. It's called a Walden guitar. So, but that's the other one. I have a dulcimer here too. So
Yes.
Oh, well, when I'm coming to Italy next week for a month, and I'm traveling with a friend who teaches mountain dulcimer.
okay.
Oh, because of COVID, she's been doing online workshops. So she has students from all over the world. She was just in England teaching a workshop. Anyway, she would love to see that.
Could you play something, Phil?
On
the dulcimer?
Well, let's see. I'll play something. Okay. Caught me by surprise.
Sorry.
You can hear what it sounds like.
No, keep going. I just want to hear the tune one more time.
I'm not warmed up.
That's a great tune.
That's an Irish tune. Yes, she begs, she more. So. Yeah.
Oh, well, I know that tune.
Yeah.
Turlock O'Carolyn. Yeah.
I have to practice a little bit first.
I knew that I knew it, but with all the way you decorated it, I couldn't quite place it. But I know that tune very well. Yeah, that's a nice tune.
Yeah. The dulcimer is so gentle and sweet.
Yeah, beautiful.
And Phil also goes to the north of Iceland and works with the sheep.
Yeah, not so much anymore. So.
I've seen wonderful photographs of that.
Yeah. We're going to round up the sheep this weekend actually. And also I just back to the topic. I don't know if you're interested in this, but to me, this learning about Sara Parker Remond is kind of like learning about a family friend because my family is related to people like Parker Pillsbury, who was one of the most prominent abolitionists in the 19th century, and also my great aunt was a friend of John Greenleaf Whittier, who and he wrote her a letter in 1834 telling her about Samuel J. May, who Sara Parker Remond traveled to England with, and he was a Unitarian minister.
Oh, so you have a connection to her.
Yeah, well, it's just sort of a very distant connection. But when I'm hearing about her, learning about her, I feel sort of very connected. And I look at this. I have a photo here of this is the girl here is my great grandmother, and yes. Over here, the two people who raised her mother ran a station of the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire, and the brother of Parker Pillsbury is here, and
wonderful,
Sara
yes.
Parker Remond and Parker Pillsbury and Abby Foster and Stephen Foster would travel together and lecture together. And I guess Sara Parker Remond was inspired by Abby Foster, and they hosted Abby Foster and Stephen Foster at their house. So yeah, so for me, just it's almost like like a sort of distant friend or something like that
Yes.
through
Well,
my
that
family.
photograph is your extended family. That's your
His
Well,
ancestors.
family.
yeah, and it's like there's also the mayor of Charleston during the Reconstruction and Civil War. He was the brother of Parker Pillsbury, and then there's like a Civil War commander, and his brother, who was the mayor of Concord.
Concord, Mass.
Yeah, and Albert Pillsbury, who drafted the bylaws of the NAACP. So it's the family of
Mhm.
who did quite a lot of work for social justice. Parker Pillsbury and Stephen Foster, they would get beaten when they went to lecture, and so yeah, it's quite interesting, and I love reading about the history of abolitionism, and I like what Whittier says in his letter to my great aunt about Samuel May. He says, "Would to heaven that all Unitarians were like him, as tender of conscience, as zealous of good works, as fervent in prayer, as fearless in the performance of duty." And Samuel May was the uncle of Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. And so, but the people in this picture, I'm sure at least several of them met and spoke with Sara Parker Remond.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's fascinating.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
just a little bit of a
So
personal.
did your family's commitment to social justice carry right through the civil rights era?
No, there weren't any active members then. Yeah, it just sort of we became a little more sort of blend in the crowd
Yeah.
than
So
the people in that picture, I suppose.
So how did you find out about those connections?
I have a diary written by my great grandmother in 1854, and she mentions people coming to their house like Stephen Foster and Abby Kelly Foster, and John P. Hale, who's a politician. His daughter, a photograph of her was found in the pocket of John Wilkes Booth when he was assassinated. So John P. Hale, he was an abolitionist also, and I know that they were thought to have run a station of the Underground Railroad, but they were all highly active in abolitionism and in suffragism and things like that. So
yes, it is interesting that this connection of women and abolitionism, because I think Elizabeth Barrett Browning very much identifies with all of these other oppressed groups because she is herself oppressed, and it's a way.
Did she know that she was
absolutely
descended from
yes
slaves in Jamaica?
yes she says in Aurora Lee, if my father were a Negro, she says, and she knows that this is the case, and it's the family. I mean, the father didn't want any of his 12 children to marry because he was afraid there would be a black baby.
But he had 12 children with a white woman?
Yes, and she was from a Scottish family where they were doing slave trading. Scotland is rife with the story of slavery, marmalade, and everything else.
So, but they were actually married to each other.
Yes.
He was not her slave. She did not own him. She did not own her husband, the man who fathered her children.
He marries her. She's a Graham from Scotland, and he's from Jamaica, and the families are connected through the slave trade. And Elizabeth inherits the slave ship, the David Lion. That's what she uses for her laudanum. It's the only money she's allowed to have, and it becomes a convict ship to Australia. And the last thing she does is to write to have that ship sold. And I think she's been coerced by Robert to sell it, because the title is only in her name. He can't touch it. It's an absolute, and David Lyon, of course, is a very Scottish name. And it's just tragic seeing this, because she was earning so much money, but he got it all. She wasn't allowed to touch it.
Julia, the day I met you up in Fiesole,
Yes.
where you say it's Montebaney, but I thought it was Fiesole, but whatever.
Yes.
Okay, so the day I met Julia, I was asked with my father and my daughter to come up to meet this person who wanted to work at the cemetery. This was a man from the Swiss Reformed Church who had befriended my father years earlier. And he asked us a favor. He said, would you mind coming to Fiesole? Well, you don't have to twist my arm to get me to Fiesole. But we go up there and we knock on the door of this little room, and there's Julia, who launches into a lecture about how Robert Browning, she was pretty sure Robert Browning encouraged Elizabeth Barrett Browning's laudanum addiction. And this man who brought us there didn't have good enough English. He did not have good enough English to
know what I was
understand
saying. Yes.
her accent or who she was or what she was talking about. But I felt like I just walked
Except
into a
he
graduate
owned the
school.
tomb of her. Yes.
Right, but it was like walking into a graduate school lecture at high speed. I mean, the lecture was at high speed, and you were talking about this same thing,
Yes.
about his taking advantage of her
Mhm.
in different ways, which shocked me completely. And I thought, how does she know? How do I know that what she's telling me is true?
And then it got more verified with the archives here.
So anyway, I just want to say that Julia has been stirring up a lot of history in a lot of directions ever since I met her. And now I've come to understand that she actually has the information to back it up.
Yes, that was really shocking when I went through these church archives, the burials, because Robert paid cheapest amount possible for her burial. And then he writes, I'm glad I'm spared the bother of coming to see the tomb. I couldn't care if it was of gold or wood or whatever. And he's really annoyed about it. But she was begging in her last letter to her sister. She's writing against the Church of England. And he then sees to it that she gets the Church of England burial. The Swiss have to pay the tax to the Anglican priest. They have to pay for his carriage, have to pay for his black gloves and his feathers and so on and so forth. Robert buries her hugger-mugger over in a corner. Leighton says, no, she must be buried in a better position. So she has to be buried twice. So the Swiss have to pay their gravedigger twice over. They end up getting less than for a pauper from her, from Robert's payments. And you know, when you read those accounts, the Swiss got about 112 pauli. Theodore Parker's tomb burial cost over 1,000 pauli. This is a huge difference. The Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn, her burial was over 1,000 pauli. The Croatian deserter, the payment to the gravedigger was the same as it was. Well, the payment to to the gravedigger for Elizabeth happened to have to be doubled because there were two graves dug, one not being considered by Leighton decent enough. But Robert imposed all of that, and not only that, the slave in the family, Treppy, who, with her inheritance from the slave owner, she paid for the publication of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's essay on mind when she was 20.
Wait a
And
minute, did Elizabeth Barrett Browning own a slave herself?
No, she was in the family.
She was in the family.
The family grew up
Mm.
with Treppy, and they adored Treppy. She was so much beloved. She had come from Jamaica with the family, with the children, and she was the sort of the center of their culture, and they adored her. And then when Robert found out she had inherited money, he got his friend Count Cottrell to persuade her to speculate with it, and it was all lost. And Robert was forbidding Elizabeth to write to get help from her brothers. She could only write to her sisters, who had no money because they were Victorian women and not allowed to have money. And Elizabeth was not allowed to have any of her money. Kenyon had left a huge inheritance to Robert and Elizabeth, but Elizabeth got none of it. All she got was the David Lyon ship money.
So Julia, we've gone far afield. I'm sorry I triggered you
Yes.
into this lecture.
Right. Well, what was so sad was Treppy went mad over this. She felt so betrayed by her own family, who had managed to bilk her out of every penny she had. And that was Robert's doing. And he could have so easily have restored to her the funds. It wouldn't have cost him anything because he had a huge sum at his disposal.
So did Treppy live with Robert and Elizabeth?
Treppy was in London.
Oh, okay.
With the Barretts in Wimpole Street. But Elizabeth was always writing letters. They were very, they all cared for her and so forth. But it was the women against the men. The men thought it was all right to take the women's money. And Robert put up a good show before he married her, saying he would write a settlement and would protect her funds and so on. But it didn't work out that way. And it's the great Victorian love story. Sorry about being so, I'd already seen that. And then it was also verified even more with the burial records, the letters to her sister and so forth. It was just, she did at least write Casa Guidi Windows and Aurora Lee. Before that, she'd written Runaway Slave at Pilgrim Point, which was a wonderful anti-slavery poem. And then Robert complained that she hadn't written anything good since Aurora Lee. But that was when he was overdosing her with laudanum.
Well, that was the thing you said in Fiesole that totally shocked me. That he was doing that intentionally.
Yeah. Because she was a threat to him. She was so admired. She was proposed for Poet Laureate. She was a bestseller. He was pocketing the money, but she was, I came across in my convent an encyclopedia that was published before they eloped. Just at the moment of the elopement, and they describe it. This is a wonderful story of these two poets in love who elope. She's 40, but he doesn't know that. He never knew her age, that she was older than he. And it was such a wonderful romantic story. And in The Ring and the Book, he is both her rescuer and also the husband who murders her.
Whose book is that?
Robert's.
he wrote a book called The Ring in
The
the
Ring in the
Book.
Book, right, in which the husband murders the wife. And he describes finding this murder story, legal papers in San Lorenzo Market. He comes home, he tosses the book up by the mirror in Casa Guidi. And Elizabeth says, oh, do put it away, it's so morbid. And he's just elated with this book. And then when she dies, he continues writing this poem. And it's a bit like this talk where the end and the beginning are the same. It ends and begins with the mirror and her as a bird, the bar, that was her nickname, which is the soul which can't return to the tomb unless it has the portrait and the name in Egyptian religion. He made very sure that her portrait is not on her tomb, nor is her name. And he writes in the book that you tell the tale obliquely in order to disguise it. And if you know the expression in Italian, giallo, is like an Agatha Christie murder mystery. It's a giallo is a crime book. And the old yellow book, which he bases The Ring in the Book on, is a crime book. It's like, do you remember there was a G.K. Chesterton story where the criminal puts all of the evidence in clear view and it's so obvious that nobody catches on? And I think that's what he did. And then he was the one who kept publishing her worst poetry. And he was the one who was lionized. And I think Sara Parker Remond was rather more sensible about not getting into a romantic marriage. and she seemed to have separated from her husband, going to Rome and carrying on as a doctor professionally instead of following into the role of a housewife. And Elizabeth was trying to run a whole household with a child and servants, writing books. And at the same time, she was terribly ill, in a lot of pain from probably tuberculosis of the spine and so on. It's amazing what she did. But I think at the end, she just got too tired to carry on. I've been talking too long. Let's next time, would you like, there are two possibilities, one possibility. I gave a talk at the Laurentian Library on Purple Gospels. And it's really quite wonderful. It's on women and gospels, ancient books that were dyed purple and written with gold and so forth.
Well, Julia, didn't you already do the Purple Gospels for one of the academia?
Did I?
I think you did, because I remember sitting in on it. Maybe you forgot to record it.
Okay, I'll check to see if I did. What else could we talk on?
Well, you just did a whole presentation on Elizabeth Barrett Browning without anybody knowing you were going to do it.
No, she just gave up. I think because you asked. Right.
Well, well, what I wonder is, well,
we talked about Dante, we talked about Brunetto, we've talked about the Roma.
I think I missed the Purple Gospels one, so I would be happy to hear that.
I don't remember actually doing it, but
well, what I remember is that I didn't know what to expect, and then as it turned out, the purple. Well, I mean, it's better if Julia tells it as part of the presentation. See if you recorded it or not, though. Maybe you forgot to.
Okay, I've got the table of contents of the Academia Bessarion, and I'll check. I'm sorry, but any other suggestions from, because we can all, any one of us can do a presentation. We do them on the first Tuesday of the month at 8 o'clock Florence time.
None of us can do it the way you do it, Julia.
Oh, I think you can.
No, oh
I think
no.
Phil can. Right. Okay, it'll be a surprise one then. So,
Okay.
okay. And so now we should say good night and thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Julia.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.